Sydney Fazard for Rebel News, coming to you from downtown Calgary, Alberta, a Canadian province which might be on the verge of separation, and with good reason.
A federal election is not going to change the inequities of Canadian federalism or change the structure of the Canadian Constitution. So we're proceeding regardless. On current polling, to the extent that Ontario, all of the so-called have-not provinces in Canada are going to elect a Carney government so that they can keep drawing money out of Alberta to subsidize inefficient governments in those jurisdictions. I think that all but guarantees, on the basis of the demands that Danielle Smith put forward to the government, that there will be a referendum this year and that the referendum will succeed. I think the election of a Carney government basically spells the end of Canada as we presently know it.
After generations of neglect and abuse by the federal government in Ottawa, many in Alberta have had enough and are strongly considering a move towards provincial independence. This feeling has escalated drastically in the past few months as the Liberal Party has not only provoked a trade war with the world's biggest superpower and our closest ally, the United States, but also allowed for the expat globalist Mark Carney to replace Trudeau's prime minister without an election, mandate from Canadians, or even a seat in the House of Commons. Now, recently, Rebel News conducted a poll through Ledger, showing that if given the option to separate from Canada and join the United States, 10% of the province would agree. And if the Liberals win the next election, this jumps to 15%. But remember, this is a poll on separating and joining the United States. Today, however, the topic is simply separating from Canada once and for all. Mere days ago, an election was called, but for many Albertans, the damage has already been done. For separatists, two outcomes have risen to the forefront. Either the federal party that wins will adhere to the provincial demands laid out by Premier Danielle Smith, and Alberta retains its confederation status, or a referendum for independence will be held in the near future, which could solidify plans for the province to separate from Canada once and for all.
Canada would consider an energy embargo on the United States. And I want to, as leverage, what do you think, what do you make of what she said?
Well, first of all, it's oil and gas is owned by the provinces, principally Alberta, and we won't stand for that. And you should never, ever threaten something you cannot do.
If they were to proceed down that path for some reason, what would be Alberta's response?
Well, they will have a national unity crisis on their hands at the same time as having a crisis with our U.S. trade partners.
We interviewed Alberta lawyer and separation advocate Jeffrey Rath during his press release today, March 26th, to see exactly what the independence movement is planning and how likely separation actually is.
Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion, should we join the United States? Should we be a standalone independent state? Those are all questions for another day. The initial mission is to have a referendum for independence, and then following that, all of the subsequent questions can be answered in terms of future relationships with the United States. There's nothing wrong with having a citizens' initiative to move something like this forward. But again, it's not just me. I'm also involved with the Alberta Prosperity Society and the Alberta Prosperity Project. We have over 66,000 members, supporters, and volunteers firmly committed to gather, if Danielle Smith will not call a referendum herself this year, firmly committed to gathering the signatures that we need under the Citizens Initiative Act to have a referendum this year on that basis. And, quite frankly, given that it looks like Mark Carney is likely to be elected as the next Prime Minister of Canada, I don't think we have any option now other than to vote for independence to protect ourselves from another 4 years of devastating misrule by a Liberal government in Ottawa that actually thinks that it can use shutting down Alberta oil to the United States as a negotiating tactic in a trade war that the Liberals themselves started for the sole purpose of winning an election.
I call him Governor Trudeau, but he's Prime Minister Trudeau when he was Prime Minister. And I said, do you think it's fair that we're paying $200 billion to keep Canada going? And what would happen, I asked him, what would happen if we didn't do that, if we didn't subsidize Canada? He said, we'd be a failed nation. And I said, then you should be a state.
There are several other retired members of parliament that were here today. I've had expressions of interest from sitting members of the legislature of Alberta that fully support what we're doing. Obviously, to the extent that Premier Smith has indicated that failing Canada meeting the conditions that she set out in her recent communication to Prime Minister Carney, there'll be a referendum this year. So obviously, from our perspective, we have the support of Premier Smith for a referendum this year that we're very grateful for. And obviously, win or lose, we're very excited that adult Albertans are finally going to be able to express their will as adults as to whether or not they want to remain in Canada. I can't imagine for the life of me that, given how well educated our province is and how well educated our citizens are, once all of the benefits of independence were fully explained to them, that they wouldn't vote overwhelmingly to get Alberta out of Canada. And one of the things that we're proposing is that whether we succeed in the referendum this year or not, we're proposing that the Alberta government adopt legislation that says that after every federal election, within 6 months, there has to be an independence referendum. And the reason that we say that is we've all learned too often in Alberta that Toronto and Montreal effectively decide who's going to rule Alberta. And what we would like to see is legislative change in this province to make it so that Albertans can decide, after Toronto and Montreal decides who's going to be the boss of us, whether or not we want to be bossed around by them anymore. And I think that we need to institutionalize independence and independence referendums in Alberta and make that part of our continuing political dialogue until we finally achieve freedom from Canada.
This is a topic that has been talked about for a long time. It hasn't come to fruition. Why is now the time to escalate the conversation?
Well, because I think people in Alberta realize that we're at a tipping point in history, that we can't afford another 5 years or 4 years of complete misgovernance by people from outside of Alberta that don't understand us, don't respect us, just literally look at our province as a cash cow to be squeezed dry of all of its resources for the benefits of provinces that have been cheating the equalization formula for years. And I think that, this has all come to a head because of all of the misgovernance by the Trudeau government, everything from, the COVID lockdowns to forced vaccinations to taking away our rights to travel, hotel incarcerations, the massive Trudeau gun grab where they're telling farmers and ranchers and hunters and sportsmen and, sportswomen all over Alberta that if Trudeau doesn't like the shape of your gun, he can just issue a decree in Ottawa to have your firearm confiscated and sent to the front lines in Ukraine. Stupidest idea ever. I mean, I'm not sure what the Ukrainians are going to do with somebody's 22 caliber Gopher rifle that Trudeau decided he doesn't like. But this is the level of stupidity that we're being governed by. So there'd be no more federal income tax. There'd be no GST. There'd be no excise tax. There'd be no carbon tax. There'd be no more equalization payments where taxes, pension, and UI benefits included, we send $70 billion plus a year to Ottawa and get less than $35 billion a year back from the rest of Canada, or Confederation as it's called. So imagine the wealth and the prosperity of this province with all of that money remaining in the province, remaining in the provincial economy. Imagine Alberta with control of its own immigration, so that where we have cities that don't have enough water, don't have enough electricity, don't have enough housing, that we can say, hang on, no vacancy, time out, until we sort out all the people that are presently here and we accommodate everybody that's here and have a sensible immigration policy as opposed to what we've been dealing with. Like literally, if we get rid of all federal taxation in Alberta, the take-home pay and the disposable income of every Albertan will more than double. And what really tore it for me was when Trudeau started that trade war with the United States, when he and Doug Ford were standing up saying that they were going to cut off the oil to the United States to teach the Americans a lesson. And of course, you didn't hear Doug Ford saying that he was going to shut down automotive parts plants for 2 or 3 days to demonstrate how integrated the North American automobile industry was. No, they were going to shut off Alberta oil. But then they didn't even realize, they were so stupid, they didn't realize that Ontario's oil from from Alberta actually goes down through the States and then up through Line 9 in Ontario. So if they shut off Alberta oil to punish Donald Trump, which is what they're claiming they were going to do, they were effectively going to shut off the oil to Ontario.
Well, let me be clear from the Alberta perspective. Under no circumstances will Alberta agree to cut off oil and gas exports.
Again, for me, it just underlined the level of stupidity and ignorance of politicians from Montreal, from Quebec, from Toronto have when it comes to the Alberta economy and Alberta energy and the integral part we play in North American energy supply and economic security. So, I'm a relatively well-educated man. Most of my friends are extremely well-educated people, and we're all just fed up being governed by idiots that don't even have a clue as to what they're doing.
So when I say they should be a state, I mean that. I really mean that, because we can't be expected to carry a country that is right next to us on our border. It would be a great state. It would be a cherished state. The taxes for Canadian citizens would go down in less than half.
From a U.S. perspective, why wouldn't they support U.S. independence or Alberta independence? President Trump recently announced at the joint session of Congress that he was fully in support of self-determination for Greenland.
For the incredible people of Greenland, we strongly support your right to determine your own future. And if you choose, we welcome you into the United States of America.
Surely we can hope that President Trump will also support self-determination for Alberta, because clearly it's in the U.S. interest to have a secure energy supply that isn't being subject to arbitrary regulation, production caps, emission caps, and all of these other things that Ottawa arbitrarily imposes on Alberta out of some misguided notion that anything we do in Canada is going to somehow offset all of the CO2 increases being put out by India and China, which dwarf all of our CO2 savings in Alberta and Canada on an annualized basis. So all of these things, would be dealt with within a common sense Commonwealth of Alberta operating as an independent nation.
How much of this do you think can pass with Trump specifically? Because obviously he's only in for 4 years. Are you concerned about the next presidents?
No, not at all. Because again, the first step towards any future decisions as to future relationships has to be Alberta independence, full stop. Right? And, so I think we get there, we get our affairs in order, and then Albertans can decide once we become the most prosperous country in the world with the highest GDP per capita in the world, completely self-sufficient with our own armed forces, all the rest of it, integrated into NATO, et cetera, whether or not we actually need to join the United States or we just have a robust free trade agreement with the U.S. where we have complete freedom of movement of goods across the U.S. and Alberta borders. We get rid of U.S. customs and put up customs depots, on the BC and Saskatchewan borders, and territorial borders, to make sure that all of the terrorists that Trudeau's let into Canada don't get into Alberta or the United States. And we call it a day. I mean, I think that, this would be a benefit to both Alberta and the United States. And certainly from an energy supply perspective, even just an independent Alberta, as opposed to an Alberta within Canada, is in the U.S. interest because of the degree of interference that Ottawa continually threatens with regard to security of supply of oil and gas to the United States. I mean, the recent tariff debacle being the perfect example, where Trudeau thinks that then Ford thought it was perfectly acceptable to shut off Alberta oil supplies to the United States. Obviously, an independent Alberta would never do anything that stupid. The idea of going to Washington to meet with representatives of the Trump administration is to go down on a fact-finding basis, to ask questions and to determine the level of support that the government of the United States would be prepared to provide to an independent Alberta. We're doing this as independent citizens, but we have, from our perspective, a strong mandate given the will of the people of the province of Alberta for independence. At 37%, we represent at this point over 1.85 million people in the province of Alberta that are interested in getting out of Canada at this time. And certainly what we're proposing to the United States is in the interest of the United States, and we see no reason that they wouldn't want to talk to us.
When it comes to Alberta being its own country, it would share an international border with two countries. It would be Canada and it would be the United States. Does that kind of put us at the whims of America, because the other trading partner we would have by land would probably be feeling a bit sour towards us?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, there's still massive benefits for Canada continuing to have a strong economic association with Alberta. I mean, we still supply virtually all of Ontario's oil, all the oil and gas that flows from Alberta through British Columbia to British Columbia ports create jobs in that province. Certainly any threats by BC, Ontario, or Canada or whatever. I mean, rail lines to get from British Columbia to Ontario have to pass through, Alberta. So, I mean, that cuts both ways. I don't think it's a realistic scenario that Canada's going to cut off its nose to spite its face. I think they're going to have to learn to live with the fact that, the goose with the golden egg, rather than being, that was laying the golden eggs, rather than being killed, decided to fly the coop. I don't think that those are very realistic scenarios. And, we look forward to a robust, peaceful, and, happy relationship with both as the Commonwealth of Alberta, with both the United States and Canada.
Sidney Fizzard with Rebel News. How do you address people's concerns about the military, assets in Canadian dollars, and treaties with Indigenous groups?
Well, I'll start with Indigenous groups, because I've devoted my entire life to the rights of Indigenous people in Canada and in Alberta. I am a firm believer in the fact that the sovereign Indigenous nations of Alberta will have a far better deal from an independent Commonwealth of Alberta than they would ever get from Canada. This would be an opportunity for them to negotiate constitutionalized resource revenue sharing and other things that could be put in place that would provide them far better revenue, far better security, and far better honor of their treaties than anything that the government of Canada has done. As somebody who's litigated those treaties against Canada my entire working career, I can tell you the government of Canada has zero respect for the Indigenous people of Alberta. And the main reason I got involved with APP, because I was concerned about some of the independence groups, having a high level of antipathy towards Alberta Indigenous rights and so on. I got involved with APP to ensure that the rights of Indigenous people in this province are respected in the context of any independence project going forward. As to the military question, I think that's a pretty simple answer. Alberta, given the amount of money we've contributed to Canada over the years and the deficit on the equalization side, I think the position of the Commonwealth of Alberta would be that all Canadian military assets in Alberta belong to Alberta, and that Alberta would happily commit 3% of its GDP on a going forward basis to the creation of an Alberta National Guard that could be fully integrated into the U.S. command structure to defend the province of Alberta. So I think that answers that one. And what was the third point?
About assets in Canadian dollars.
Well, that's one of the things that we need to speak to the U.S. administration about, is is support for independence. Would support for independence include converting pension assets in Alberta into U.S. dollars, or alternatively, include providing a line of credit sufficient for all Alberta assets to be converted into Alberta dollars, to be protected and covered off through the period of transition. Obviously, there's going to be a period of transition. Currency is going to be a big issue, and those are some of the issues that we hope to discuss with the U.S. administration on a fact-finding basis, so that when we're done with that, we can then come to Alberta and, through the auspices of APP and all of the volunteers that are involved in this project, have a series of town halls all over the province where we can answer everybody's questions and tell them, what we've uncovered from a fact-finding basis with regard to support for those very issues.
I'd like to just add one little piece on the First Nations, the Indian Act. I was a member of the committee that looked after that group of people, and the Indian Act did nothing for the First Nations people. Trying to get out of it was extremely difficult, and trying to work with it was even worse. So getting rid of the Indian Act, freeing up that for the First Nations people, I think will be a huge, huge benefit for every First Nations person here in Alberta.
As far as it goes, I just want to thank all of the Albertans that have been reaching out and offering their support. It's frankly been overwhelming. I mean, everywhere I go, my friends and neighbors and ranchers and people that I haven't seen for years are reaching out. I ran into people just this morning filling up my truck with diesel to come into town this morning, and people were, stopping me and thanking me for what I'm doing. And, I get the sense that support for this project is overwhelming, and it's far greater than the 37% that the polls are currently indicating.
It seems like this upcoming federal election will yield one of two results. Either Pierre Poilievre will win, and possibly we'll see movement on the demands made by Premier Danielle Smith, or Mark Carney will actually get elected this time, and undoubtedly the separation movement is going to skyrocket. Time will tell. For Rebel News, I'm Sidney Fazard.
There will be change. There will be a new leader, Rashi. So
what, real change?
There will be a real change, and that's the Liberal.
Are you sure? Because the Conservative slogan is just like Justin.
Yeah, but that's their narrative.
Everything is on the table.
Nothing is off the table.
If you want to see more stories like this that matter to Albertans and showcase the federal government's mismanagement of the province, go to handsoffalberta.ca.